Fish can't leave the water, nor melons leave the vine. The revolutionary masses can't do without the Communist Party. Mao Zedong thought is the sun that always shines. Fish can't leave the water, nor melons leave the vines. The revolutionary masses can't live without the Communist Party. Mao Zedong thought is the sun that always shines.
Have crippling depression.
Hello friends. For many months now I've been holding back on creating a video like this, publicly denouncing Jason Unruhe, until I had a larger audience. As my sub count is on the fast track towards 1,000, I thought it was finally time.
I do not think you actually understand Jason Unruhe. We are going to examine your ideological conceptions of the material world. To me, it is essential to do this, as I find people with your ideological views a detriment to the leftist community of the website. And the website has ideological influences on the real world to a certain extent. It is extremely essential to really do this. There has to be a counter to your own ideals, and it's important to really deconstruct the concepts in a way that will prevent certain ideological conversions.
I was not always the kind of Marxist I am today. I too was once a bright-eyed young leftist who had recently joined the community. Like many newcomers, I followed Jason Unruhe and was tightly woven into the Unruhe cult, believing whatever he produced to be the truth. Today I stand in opposition to Jason Unruhe, on the opposite side of the room, dismissing, disagreeing, and disassociating him from the left. Why is that? This video will aim to provide reasons for why you should never take Jason Unruhe seriously ever again.
This is borderline slander. There is no cult of Jason Unruhe. You can criticize his channel, and you will have dozens of individuals agreeing with you. It is really not really a good thing to just say that to people. I find that very biased to a negative form. It is not really something you really want to say about someone without undeniable proof. If I was like you, completely in that attitude, I can say that ContraPoints, a channel you're subscribed to, can fit that description of a cult of personality. That's not really a good thing to say.
Jason Unruhe has repeatedly shown he has very twisted and incorrect views on dialectics. Let us begin with Jason's so-called third worldism. One of the pillars of third worldism is that the first world working class has supposedly lost its ability to engage in revolution because it has been bought off by the imperialist bourgeoisie. We're going to assume that this is done unconsciously, through high standards of living and a greater expansion of political freedoms than many find in the third world. Third worldists actually deny the existence of a first world proletariat. They believe the class struggle has been supposedly wiped away by high standards of living and outsourcing, and as a result, the first world proletariat has been supplemented with a global labor aristocracy. This means they have lost their class interest for revolution and would now side with the imperialist bourgeoisie. This is not only a misunderstanding of dialectics, but an outright rejection of dialectics. This is a purely analytical perspective, not a dialectical perspective. From this perspective, class is based on living standards, income level, and other arbitrary measurements. This purely analytical perspective is not suited for understanding the antagonistic dialectical relationship between the owners of capital and all their employees. Through materialist dialectics, we understand that class is based on one's relation to capital, and that those who work under capital will always have interests at odds with those who own capital. So long as classes exist, there is class struggle. Adopting the analytical perspective is a clear rejection of Marxist dialectics.
Dialectics is simply the process of conflicts between two binaries in the material world, or any world that you think of if you view things in the traditional Hegelian way. Dialectics is, as I said before, the conflict of binaries. That is what it is. That is what it was for many years, and for many more years to come. That is what dialectics is. The problem with his critique of Jason Unruhe is that he does not go into detail about the dialectics. He says he's not dialectical, but he doesn't really explain exactly why. He claims that he's analytical instead, and he just chucks all the claims, all the things involving analytical thought into such a simplistic way that is not really respectable in my opinion. Dialectics is something I believe Jason holds as a belief. And Lilez, I believe his name is, doesn't really understand that dialectics involves examination of the world around you. It involves statistics. It needs all these aspects of data to come to a conclusion. To look at one opposite and another is to compare their data, to compare their characteristics, their components, all these things that make them is exactly the thing we need. But I don't think he really understands. I will show you a clip from one of my older videos. My video on spaghetti will help.
Thesis and antithesis. The spaghetti is the thesis, and the meatballs is the antithesis. Together they make spaghetti and meatballs. The Italian is superior because they make the best slapping sounds.
Another pillar of third worldism is its historical analysis. Third worldists, especially Jason, hold that the first world has never had base areas, and that all revolutionary struggles, since the development of the imperialist and imperialized worlds, have come from the poorest regions on Earth. They say this is specifically because the proletariat of these countries are worked in slavish conditions, and once crisis strikes, have no choice but to rebel. However, this notion that poverty and crisis are the determinant factors for revolutionary situations comes from an analytical outlook and not a dialectical outlook. It is the most surface level of observations and does not take into account the whole picture of a revolutionary situation. In Russia, for example, Stalin was very clear, in the foundations of Leninism, that a revolution came to Russia chiefly because it was on the eve of a bourgeois revolution. Not because of the rampant poverty, not because of the First World War, but because the Russian bourgeoisie was on the eve of their bourgeois revolution, and indeed did carry out that bourgeois revolution in February.
There is no problem with examining statistics and data. It is an important process of this examining the material world. I don't see how this contradicts with dialectics. It is idealistic in the way you view things, that when something happens, it happens. And it happens because your vague views of dialectics. To me, dialectics are the binary conflicts, and these binary conflicts require some deep examinations.
China's conditions for revolution were twofold. First, similar to Russia, China had recently experienced her bourgeois revolution. Secondly, China was engaged in a national liberation struggle, which was principally led by the communists. The current revolutionary conflicts in the world find their heart not simply in the level of poverty in the country or area, but in anti-imperialist and national liberation struggles, like India and the Philippines. The Communist Party of the Philippines began its struggle as an anti-imperialist struggle against U.S. hegemony in its politics. The Naxalites began as an indigenous rebellion, that meaning a struggle for self-determination. So yes, while revolutions have only historically happened in poor countries, it's not chiefly because they are poor, and not because class antagonisms are intensified there. This all exemplifies the lack of dialectical perspective in the third worldist narrative.
Well, okay.
Lastly, in June of this year, Tovaris Indiaman made a critique of third worldism in which he presents the following quote straight from the hand of Mao Zedong himself.
Internally, capitalist countries practice bourgeois democracy, not feudalism when they are not fascist and not at war in their external relations. They are not oppressed by, but themselves oppress other nations. Because of these characteristics, it is the task of the party of the proletariat in capitalist countries to educate the workers and build up strength through a long period of legal struggle, and thus prepare for the final overthrow of capitalism. In these countries, the question is one of a long legal struggle of utilizing parliament as a platform, of economic and political strikes, of organizing trade unions and educating the workers. There, the form of organization is legal, and the form of struggle is bloodless, non-military. On the issue of war, the communist parties in the capitalist countries oppose imperialist wars waged by their own countries. If such wars occur, the policy of these parties is to bring about the defeat of the reactionary governments in their own countries. The one war they want to fight is the civil war for which they are preparing.
And how does Jason Unruhe, owner and sole proprietor of Maoist Rebel News, respond?
And as for this idea of a legal war that turns into a revolution, that's laughable. Is that what first worldists or people in the advanced capitalist countries have been doing for 100 years? No, actually, they've not. They've been doing Eurocommunism for 100 years. This thing that you've invented by a legal war turning into a revolution is a complete fiction. You've just made that up.
Yikes. Just made it up, did he?
Jason Unruhe is right in rejecting a concept from Mao. The thing about theories from other Marxists is that at some point it might as well become outdated. You cannot always follow something from 50 years ago or perhaps 100 years ago and expect nothing to change in your condition. Therefore, even though this is hypocritical in Jason's view, I think this is good for him to say that. It is positive because he's unconsciously standing against dogmatism.
Now we move on to Jason Unruhe's defeatism. What is defeatism, and how is he a defeatist? Put simply, defeatism is the acceptance of defeat without struggle. How is he defeatist? Let us listen in on another clip from Unruhe.
To put it in the simplest terms possible, the first world is not revolutionary because of its exploitation of the third world that buys a better living standard for its people. Thus, it is up to the third world to release itself from the shackles of the first world.
Jason, by extension of living in the first world, is one of the greatest defeatists of our time, if not the greatest. He has done nothing to aid the conditions of the third world proletariat or to aid revolutionary organizations in the third world. Because of his beliefs, he becomes worthless to himself. No action he could possibly do would amount to anything. To him, there is no amount of action which can spark a revolution in the first world.
If we want to defeat capitalism, we are going to need a party that will organize working people to fight for the demands that we want and to win socialism. Thank you so much.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Jason is right in questioning leftist movements in the West. There are many contradictions and problems within the movement. For example, you have many leftists that value paganism and all these reactionary old religions, and they don't really appeal to the masses. You have many groups that value drugs and many groups that value criminals, especially the anarchists. Many of them value criminals. You have many groups that act in ways that limit their potential. When you look at the DSA, they didn't allow clapping because they were afraid that the mentally ill will get scared. And from a point of view of a regular person, that's just crazy. But to the mentally ill, that sounds like mistreatment. It is a major problem within leftist movements in presenting oneself as reasonable or appealing to a wide audience of people or masses that will be involved in your movement. The new left, in my opinion, is a failure. It is a failure because its activism is childish. It's very infantile to the extent that it tries to make deals with drug lords. It tries to make deals with criminals. It tries to make deals with communist countries that manipulate them.
Right, there was a conference in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, I believe it was in 1949. It was an amazing conference. It was a peace conference, the Waldorf Peace Conference, and Albert Einstein was there. And all kinds of Hollywood actors were there, and Aaron Copland, the musician, was there, and Lillian Hellman, the writer, was there. And all of them were saying that the Soviet Union was right and the United States was wrong. And it drove, this was the height of McCarthyism in the United States, and it drove the CIA and the FBI and all the American agencies, intelligence agencies, deep state, it drove them crazy. They said, how can all these smart people be defending the Soviet Union? How can this be happening? It drove them up the wall. They said, we've got to do something about this. And so the CIA launched what they call the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And you can Google that term, right? That's on CIA.gov. And they consider it to be one of their greatest achievements, which was to try and manipulate this intellectual milieu and pull them away from the Soviet Union. And they hired Sidney Hook, who was a New York City Trotskyite professor, and they hired him to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the CIA started funneling money to all kinds of artists and intellectuals and thinkers, and funneling the money, and they could talk about socialism. They had no problem with them talking about socialism. They had no problem with them criticizing Western society, but they had to be anti-communist. They had to be anti-Soviet while they did it. The CIA funded a magazine called Partisan Review, right? The Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was a Trotskyite magazine, and it was very anti-capitalist, critical of capitalism, critical of the Western system, but always anti-Soviet as well, right? The CIA funded art galleries by Jackson Pollock, right? Jackson Pollock is famous for, throwing paint on the canvas, right? And they said, look at this, in the socialist countries, they just have socialist propaganda everywhere, but look how the West is beautiful. They've got Jackson Pollock who's just throwing art on the canvas. Isn't that beautiful? And the CIA made it their project to try and divide these two camps of people who become socialists. Take that revolutionary intelligentsia and get them to be further and further away from the socialist countries and further away from the working class who might become attracted to socialism in the time of a crisis. And it wasn't just art galleries, and it wasn't just Trotskyite magazines. The CIA had another program that they call MK Ultra. Are folks familiar with MK Ultra? And this was the distribution of narcotics and drugs. The CIA went out of its way to begin distributing drugs and narcotics all across college campuses. Now, I know Harvard is near here. Harvard University, I believe, is somewhere near here, right? It's a couple blocks. There was a professor there by the name of Timothy Leary. And in the 1960s, Dr. Timothy Leary, with lots of funding, started going around the United States encouraging young people who were protesting the Vietnam War and protesting for civil rights to use LSD and to use drugs. And he had this slogan, tune in, turn on, drop out. And millions of dollars was poured into this project of getting people in the United States who might become socialists and communists, who were critical of the system, to start using drugs. And the socialist movement, historically, has been one of the most anti-drug things in history. I mean, the first thing after the Chinese Revolution, they executed the heroin importers. There was always a feeling that drug addiction and narcotics addiction was something that the socialist movement was trying to cure society of. Right? It was an ill of capitalism, where people are turned into addicts that are ruthlessly exploited and worked to death and giving every last cent they have, and that drug addiction is something that the revolutionary movement was trying to cure. But lo and behold, starting in the 1960s, suddenly if you went into socialist and left circles, we all had to get high, man. It was the thing to do. And another thing that happened during this time was the rise of the Eastern cults. You know, it's very interesting. You know, the Hare Krishna movement, for example. In India, if you go to India, you talk to communists in India, which I have, they're considered in India to be one of the most right-wing movements that they are. They're Hindu nationalists. They want to restore very traditional, conservative things in India. However, in the United States, if you go to left-wing marches and peace rallies, there's the Hare Krishna movement. And look at them, they're Eastern, man. They're wearing their orange robes, and you suddenly saw Eastern mysticism and things like that accepted in left circles. Another example is the Dalai Lama. You know, the feudal kingdom that existed in Tibet was something that was deeply admired by Nazi Germany. So much to the point that this book that is widely promoted in left liberal circles now, 7 Years in Tibet, the author of it is Heinrich Harrer. And Heinrich Harrer was a member of Hitler's SS. He was actually, that's why he was in Tibet and had the opportunity to so closely observe feudal Tibet. And that Julius Evola, another thinker who was associated with Italian fascism, was just blown away by how authoritarian and strict Tibetan society was. And he was saying to the Europeans, this is what we need to recreate it. In fact, one of the reasons the Nazis adopted the swastika as their symbol was because the Nazis really admired the caste system of India. Because they said, look, there's no strikes and protests or anything. Everyone's just born into their caste. It's perfect. This is the ancient traditional way. It was always understood in Europe prior to the Second World War, the mainstream viewpoint was Christianity. That was the mainstream viewpoint. Most people were Christians. The left promoted science and dialectical materialism, and it was the extreme right and the fascists that tended to promote Eastern mysticism and the occult and that kind of thing. But after the Second World War, all of a sudden in left-wing circles, Eastern mysticism and the occult, along with the drugs, along with the anti-Soviet stuff, suddenly flows into left circles. And you have a lot of foundations that are funding this kind of thing.
A federal grand jury in Detroit today charged the 13 top leaders of the Weathermen with plotting to bomb public buildings in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Berkeley, California. The Weathermen are the militant faction of the Students for a Democratic Society. Only one of the 13 is now in custody.
At 7:30 this morning, KPFK received a call from a woman identifying herself as a member of the Weather Underground.
Hello. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives. Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are. In every tribe, commune, dormitory, farmhouse, barracks, and townhouse, where kids are making love, smoking dope, and loading guns, fugitives from American justice are free to go. Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
Power belongs to the young people and the black people in this country. Come on, we gotta fight it out. We gotta build a strong base, and someday we gotta knock those motherfuckers who control this thing right on their ass.
The FBI said the Weather Underground organization, which took credit for the bombing, is the same radical group which was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Capitol in 1971 and the Pentagon in 1972. But federal officials don't really know much about the group, which is believed to have between 20 and 30 members.
My name is Bernadine Dorn, and I was part of the Weather Underground from, well, it's hard to say when it started, 1970 to 1980. It was underground for 11 years.
There's no way to be committed to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created. I'm not committed to nonviolence in any way.
I'm a teacher now in a community college, and my students will occasionally bring up the war in Vietnam and ask me what my involvement was. And I'll say, well, I helped found an organization whose goal was the violent overthrow of the government of the United States. And my students would look at me as if I'm from another planet.
This system is going to be overthrown. It's going to mean a fight. And it's going to mean a lot of white people risking a lot of things when they finally join on the side of the black people and the people of Vietnam and around the world who have already begun the fight.
I'm not going to tell you, oh, I walked in here this day and put a bomb here, or I made this here, or I blew up this car, or I held up this bank. I mean, there were armed robberies. They were all armed robberies, terrorism. You know, there was all kinds of things that went down that were illegal. So I tell you that we did them, but I'm not going to tell you which ones I did or who did what, because you just can't do that.
At best, he believes we need to sit tight for a catastrophic crisis to hit, then begin action. Regardless, it is clear Unruhe is defeatist, and as such we cannot expect him to act, nor can we condone those who tail behind him. Defeatism is a cancer among the left, a disease which must be eradicated.
The real disease is the type of leftism that you believe in. It is simplistic and idealistic. It is not appealing to the masses, only to upper middle class intellectuals that value intersectional Maoism. This is not something that many people will have interest in.
To engage in defeatism is to deny the point of struggle, that is, struggle in the abstract. Whether political, legal, economist, or revolutionary, it matters not, as the defeatist views them all doomed without chance. As such, defeatists like Unruhe see no reason to engage in the first place. Third of all, we must criticize Jason's transphobia. You all knew this one was coming. I've spent a lot of time on this platform defending Marxist intersectionality and the trans community as a whole, so of course, this was going to be part of my anti-Unruhe video. If you'd like to see a detailed explanation, I'm going to shamelessly plug my friend Austrian Maoist 1's video, where he goes through Jason Unruhe's transphobia.
This is very ironic coming from a Marxist-Leninist. It is full of this funny feelings, you know? It's like these people ignore history, revise it to the point in which it doesn't make sense, like it's a contradiction. In the Soviet Union, homosexuals were illegal. So it was in most of the Warsaw Pact, and the same in Maoist China. Most leftists with socially liberal ideas will usually say that Lenin decriminalized homosexuality. However, there's no proof that this actually happened. All he did was remove the penal code for Tsarist Russia. The Soviets didn't really care about it. All they did was say that everything that the Tsars have criminalized was bad. During the time of Lenin's rule, there was no official policy or attitude towards it. Many of these intersectional MLs will say that it was the 1930s, so it didn't matter. That is a unprofessional argument. I can say that in the 1830s, slavery was around America and we shouldn't pay attention to it because it was the 1830s.
What you need to know as a baseline is that, for years, Jason has consistently and deliberately attacked the trans community as liberal identity politics, misgendered people time after time again, and insinuated that the existence of trans people makes other people's lives more difficult.
That is very incorrect. Identity politics has infested many social movements, to the point in which it's hard really to distinguish the phobias of various identities with the actual critique of the ideological concept.
A concrete example of this is his behavior towards Anarcho-Pac. Repeatedly, he openly attacked Zoe's existence as a trans person. I will now let part of her video play.
Since making this video, Maoist Rebel News has made his position on trans people clear by repeatedly and deliberately misgendering me. When I identified as agender, he wrote on Twitter in September 2017 that I'm, quote, a white, upper-middle-class male without actual oppression, leeching off the third world, pretending not to. Watching the Anarcho-Pac pity party is pretty stellar. When you call him out on his class privilege, he actually thinks his personal problems are the basis for class oppression. That's the postmodernist disease for you. His childhood sucked, assuming I believe him, so therefore the global class divide in wealth doesn't exist, or that he and all the other first world people live off third world exploitation. Wait until you have to actually get a job and live like an adult. On Facebook he repeated these claims and said that I have, quote, the special snowflake victim complex which first worldists have. In January 2018 I came out on YouTube as a trans woman. Upon being linked to my video on how I've been suicidal since I was 11, which was made after I came out, Jason responded by saying, quote, I don't respect his right to live, why would I respect any other aspect about him? In February he wrote on Facebook that, quote, I just watched Anarcho-Pac attacking Finbol video, typical anarchist tripe. The video basically says that authoritarianism is wrong because of freedom. He, like them, makes the argument against authoritarianism by offering what doesn't work, has never worked, will never work. There's nothing new here. This is why he refuses to debate me. He's scared.
This Maoist tries to use moralism and emotionless concepts to try to trick the viewer into feeling complete ethical relationships with Zoe. This is reasonable, actually. You're supposed to sympathize with those with the perception of oppression. However, I feel like this is a tactical tool of slander to a certain extent. First is that many people have less knowledge of what an agender person is compared to a transgender individual. Therefore, they do not really know the pronouns for such individuals. And if you just watch certain videos that Zoe makes, she does not actually bring out her own pronouns or her gender identity. In fact, many agender individuals of a masculine background will say that they use the pronouns he and him, while the ones of feminine origins will say that they are she or her. So it's easily something that someone like Jason will get confused with, or any average individual will get confused with, without context. As for his hatred of anarcho-pac, it is obvious that one of the main factors with this is that anarcho-pac is an anarchist. That is a major contribution to the hatred between these two individuals. Anarcho-pac fits the stereotype of a anarchist, that is an individual that has family problems and has horrible issues with their psyche. Zoe can easily solve her problems if she doesn't have so much connections to the internet. The internet can be a cover for harsh mental illness or harsh depression and such things. And in a way, it is one of the most antisocial inventions of humanity.
Jason Unruhe has, for years, railed against so-called identity politics, not understanding that identity politics is an immense umbrella which encompasses white nationalist identitarianism, Marxist intersectionality, and everything in between.
The ideological concept called identity politics is very simple. It is simply the fetishization of fixed ideals around what one calls themselves. For example, I am a fleshy human being. I am a moving organism. These descriptions that I give myself are immaterial. They do not actually fit into the true reality. They are the representation of the real world in symbols. The same can be said about everything. People like you say that gender doesn't exist. That is because to you, gender is the language concept of structures that formulates into a type of construct. It is a very interesting concept, really. When we look at many objects, we give them descriptions and we call them whatever you want. Over time, these things can change. They can have new words to describe themselves. They can have new descriptions. I'm basically saying that all identities and all concepts of our mind are subjective.
An identity struggle, for example, a national liberation struggle, can be essential to the class struggle. Huey P. Newton describes the black working class as facing a wholly unique form of oppression in the United States, one which crosses the oppression of the working class with the oppression of African Americans. The wage gap, something which has been reported on and understood by economists since women entered the workplace, is the literal, material manifestation of the intersection between worker oppression and female oppression. These groups, often marginalized, experience both class oppression and identity oppression, leading to certain struggles which we simply cannot understand unless we are to experience those same struggles.
A true anti-IDPO leftist realizes that identity politics is a pragmatic tool. You're not supposed to have any attachments to it. It is something that's so fluid that it can be changed in so many ways. So when it's not useful anymore, you discard it and therefore switch over to something new. But for people like you want to be so limited into this box of limitations that prevents any open-minded opinions, any new ideas. And in case of class struggle, that is the most important identity to take advantage of. It's the most effective one to change the world, and therefore that is why we examine it and exalt it to the best form possible. Class is the greatest identity of all because it can destroy old societies that have oppressed people. It is a type of identity that can wipe oppressive systems into a blank slate for a new order. This is more than any race, any gender identity, more than anything else, because it has this goal that can morph everything around it.
But Jason Unruhe, in his ignorance, believes that identity politics can only drag down the Marxist movement. This means either one of two things. One, that Jason Unruhe believes the intersection between identity struggles and class struggles doesn't exist, and that things such as the popular women's movement and the Black Panther Party are vulgarizations, and that their struggles have hindered the development of the revolutionary movement. Or two, that Jason is blissfully ignorant of what identity politics means, and has decided to go on a 6-year-long campaign against something he never chose to look into deeper than what you'd find in an anti-SJW cringe compilation. My vote is towards the second option, truthfully, but I hope I've shown how ignorant he really is.
Jason Unruhe simply fits the first option, and your analysis is very biased and very selective of information. And it's used to create a narrative that deconstructs any serious examination.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ